Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to welcome everyone, regardless of whether you're here in the Senior Center or viewing from home or wherever else you're Zooming from, welcome. We're glad that you've joined us today. I'm just going to welcome you on behalf of the Senior Center and just let you know that we've got many wonderful programs in addition to the one you're at today. So please feel free to stop by for any of our programs. And if you need some more information, the Con Street Chronicle is our go-to source for everything that we do here. So if you don't get that, we have some copies at the desk. We can also make sure that you get an online version too. So thank you for being here today. We're glad to see you, and I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Uh-oh, now I have competition, huh? I better do something. All right, welcome everybody. We're finally starting. We're learning as hybrid has to develop here. But hi to everyone in person and those of you at Zoom. My name is Sarah Backrack. I'm a volunteer with Northampton Neighbors, and I work with the Speakers Committee, and I do welcome visits. Northampton Neighbors and Senior Center, we co-sponsor these speeches, these talks, and we'll hear from Candace Currie about green burial. But first, a little about Northampton Neighbors. We're a nonprofit organization. We started 6 years ago with 1,000 members just before COVID, and now we have more than 1,700. Our goal is helping older people age in their homes by providing both services and social events. We have special interest groups, neighborhood circles, and many kinds of gatherings. Anyone, anywhere may become a member, and anyone over the age of 55 living in Florence, Leeds, or Northampton may receive services. There's no membership fees or charges for any of our services or events. We're neighbors helping neighbors. A few logistics today. Our speaker will talk for 25 to 30 minutes and then take questions. She has agreed, if there's loads of questions remaining, to stay a little later than 3 o'clock. But we will have a hard stop at 3:15 because the room is needed. So that's information for you. For those on Zoom, please put your questions in chat. You can find chat at the bottom of your screen, except on iPads, it's at the top. If you want to read along or turn off the closed captions, press the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We suggest using the speaker view. You can find this on the top of your screen at right. We've muted everybody to avoid any background noise. The recording of this talk, you can find it on, we are recording the talk, you can find it on YouTube or on Open Media in about 48 hours or so. Our tremendous tech person, Nina Feinberg, is putting it all together. I lost my place, I gotta find that again. We suggest using the speaker view. You can find that at the top right of your screen, and we're muted. We're recording this talk, and I said that, so I'll catch up. For everyone in the audience, please just raise your hand. And we will either have you speak or come up to the microphone that we have set up in the middle of the aisle. We'll take the questions from the audience that are here after we take the questions from the Zoom audience. So now, Bob.
Can I add one thing?
Add one more thing.
My apologies for interrupting. I know there's a few folks that have come up to me that said they are having a hard time hearing here. We do not have the captions up there at the moment, but I'm going to work on doing that right now. And also just to highlight, in case you didn't hear from Sarah, this is being recorded, so we just want you to be aware of that, and the link will be available in about 48 hours or so. So please just know that we're recording this as well. We'll get the captions up as soon as we can.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And since I have hardly anything more to say, I'll try to speak much louder. It's my pleasure now to introduce Candace Currie. Candace is on the board of Green Burial Massachusetts, and their mission is to educate the public about green burials. She worked at the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge for more than 2 decades, and when she saw the graves were first lined with cement, she thought, this is crazy. So she moved out to work with the Green Burial Massachusetts. She's also the president of Green Burial Mass Cemetery, a nonprofit cemetery organization working to bring conservation cemeteries to Mass. She also lives in Western Mass, and she's a graduate of the Conway School in Sustainable Planning and Design after she got her BS at the University of Lowell. With great pleasure, here is Candace.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first in-person presentation since pre-COVID, so it's really wonderful to have a live audience, and welcome to the Zoom audience as well. So I do have a lot of slides. I do have a depth of information to handle today, but I'm really just giving you the breadth. So you can ask me questions afterwards, and I'm happy to give you answers. And if I don't have the answers today, I'll be able to get them for you. So without further ado, let's see if I can share my screen. The elements which have once moved and circulated in living do not become extinct nor useless. They become the materials from which other frames are to be constructed. So I think this expresses the essence of green burial. We're going to take a quick historic view, some comparative views of conventional cemeteries and green cemeteries. What and why is green burial? What is proposed here in Massachusetts? Some other forms of disposition that aren't actually green, and then we'll take a look at some costs and what it takes to plan. Prior to 1860, family members, church members, and even midwives were taking care of our dead. This lower image of a home parlor, this is from 1917, but that is typical of what happened. 1860s, what else happened? We had the Civil War. That was also the rise of the funeral director profession. And now, 1930s, began using what was called a vault. I'll talk a little bit about that. And in 1998 to the present, we've returned back to what happened before the 1860s with Ramsey Creek in South Carolina. Surgeons on the battlefield of the Civil War, they actually set up embalming tents. They were the people who were embalming men who died on the battlefield. They had their names and their home location pinned inside their clothing, and they were embalmed most likely with arsenic and then traveled north so that their families could have closure. This began the birth of the funeral industry, so now the home parlor has been replaced by the funeral parlor. And shortly after that, Lincoln's body was also embalmed and traveled 1,600 miles by train from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois, where millions of people were able to say goodbye to President Lincoln. When comparing cemetery settings, we have a conventional cemetery of today. This probably was Mother's Day, Memorial Day, because it's filled with flowers. And on the right-hand side, we have a mound of soil that's over a grave. In the back of this image, to the left, there's a mound of soil there. All the soil that got displaced by grave liners and the caskets get put back in the back 40 somewhere. It's hidden from sight, unlike with the mound in this natural cemetery surrounded by a field. That would be the ultimate green solution. Typically, we do have a vault, and in this case, it looks like concrete painted to look like metal, and it's in what's called a lowering device, so that a casket's going to go inside that vault. The vault will get closed, and then everything would be lowered into the grave. The image on the right is a simple open grave with some ropes laid across it that's going to receive a casket, and then it will be lowered down by human beings rather than a lowering device. Another look below the ground. On the left, we have a casket encased in concrete that's down about 5 feet in this image. It could be 5, 6, or 7, even sometimes a double casket can go, two people in one grave can go down. That's common where the water table is deep enough that it can be done in a cemetery. Versus on the right where we see a biodegradable casket that's gone down 3.5 to 4 feet. And the turf on top is different for both of them. One of them is more naturalistic. One of them is probably a lawn cemetery. So people often think embalming is required. It's not. However, it's always the local board of health that will tell a funeral home, if there's going to be a public visitation or viewing, you need to embalm the body. So the funeral director, a licensed funeral director, has learned how to do embalming, and they've learned how to do it with formaldehyde, a formaldehyde-based solution. There are other options, but they haven't learned it in school, but there are some other alternatives. So if you do want a public visitation and viewing, it can be done, but you've got to search for the right funeral director to allow that to happen. This image on the right, that's a whole bunch, that's like a dozen concrete boxes. In a cemetery that's large, they often open new sections, and in preparation for opening that section, they're going to pre-install these concrete boxes. It makes it easier to dig in the future. It makes it safer for a lawnmower when the lawnmower is mowing the lawn. They don't really have to fear too much about caving in or being disrespectful of the dead. But this slide, courtesy of the Green Burial Council, there are two things on this slide that I find interesting. It's almost 2,000 pounds of carbon dioxide per vault is going up into the air, and that's a whole lot of concrete that we don't really need to be putting in the ground. Also, and from the Wilbert Company, they're the people who started making these things in the 1930s, they said a vault has a 50 to 100 year lifespan. Well, think about that. Our cemeteries are around for a lot longer than that. So, is it really a good thing to be putting those things in the ground? Especially if we have other uses for concrete in these greater rain events that we've been getting. We need to deal with bridge collapsing, and we need larger culverts to handle those rain events. So I think it makes more sense to continue to protect our living people and not so much what's below the ground. So that's a little bit what green burial is about, whereas everything going into the ground is biodegradable. And from the clothing one is wearing to the casket or the coffin or the toe pincher, whatever you want to call it, whatever the person is buried in. And typically it includes family participation, and there's some type of environmentally sound practices going on. Some of those locally sourced containers include a pine coffin, cardboard, wicker, or even a shrouded body. Those are all valid and legal to use, but you should check with your cemetery before actually bringing those. Also, the funeral home needs to allow whatever you bring. You don't have to buy your container from the funeral director. You can say, this is what I want to use, and the funeral home has to allow you to use that. Why might you choose green burial? Well, we have a connection to nature. We have an environmental impact on our whole life. We live like this. We buy organic food. We want to be healthy and one with the earth of some sort. So there are religious reasons, cultural reasons. Cost may also be a reason. And if you ever have the opportunity to attend one of these things, where you can actually participate in the lowering of somebody into the grave, you're literally laying somebody to rest. It is cathartic. It's a way that can help you actually grieve better to be part of a process like this. So here are a couple lowering devices. And It's always nice to have shovels around too, because part of the burial process, the physical labor of actually putting soil over your loved one that's in the grave, adds to that catharsis, adds to that healing for grief. In a green burial cemetery, there's often a flat marker used as opposed to an upright monument. The depth to the bottom of the grave is usually 3 to 4 feet. The opening of the grave, that means somebody dug the grave. It's in Massachusetts, it's typically done with a backhoe. Most cemeteries don't allow visitors to actually participate in that part, but you do get to participate in the backfill afterwards. And I'll speak to density of burials in a second. Public safety. I am more dangerous to you right now alive than I would be if I were laid out in a casket right here. Basically, diseases that I have are present when I'm alive, but as soon as I die, they're no longer present. But there are a few exceptions. Ebola is one of those exceptions. We've probably all heard that people who die from Ebola, they are cremated, they are bagged and cremated. Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease is one of those diseases that someone would need to be buried in the ground right away. The CDC recommends no cremation for those folks, get them in the ground. Those are sort of the two. There's a couple more exceptions, and the CDC and the local health agent or board, whoever is responsible in your town or your community, they know how to handle some of this. So by the time the body gets to the cemetery, it's either going into the ground or going into a crematory. I know during COVID, before we really understood what was going on with COVID, people were put in potty bags. And green cemeteries were contacting us saying, what do we do? Is this okay? And in fact, yes, it's safer for you to leave that person in the body bag, and it's not going to decompose. The plastic won't decompose, but it will break down eventually. But it is still, green burial is still about safety. The Green Burial Council is an organization that has a set of standards and defines 3 types of cemeteries: a hybrid, a natural, and a conservation. The hybrid cemetery is something in a conventional cemetery. And they either have a separate section that's adjacent to the conventional cemetery, and it says, okay, over here, we're not doing any vaults or grave liners. You can be in a biodegradable container. There's no embalming, but honestly, cemeteries don't know if you're embalmed or not. By the time they get the body, they're just looking at a casket in most cases. So they don't really know it all. Typically, this is 1,000 to 1,200 burials per acre. And the image on the right is a green path. So this is a lawn cemetery. There's a couple floral tributes there. And that's where there are, in fact, some green burials. And opposite the side is a granite marker, and the names of those who are buried by those flowers are engraved on that marker. A natural burial ground, they allow 500 to 600 burials per acre, and that is a guideline from the Green Burial Council. Typically, when you drive by one of these properties, it just looked like a park or an open space or a conserved property. And technically it's conserved, and your human body is actually helping to conserve that land. A conservation burial ground is a natural burial ground that's also in partnership with a land trust. The land trust holds the easement over some part of the parcel that has a special habitat, an endangered species, something that needs to be protected. And yet still our bodies can be used to also help protect that land. And currently there's a 300 to 400 burials per acre. And that's because land trusts don't really like to go digging holes in the property. I did hear recently that some of these burial densities per acre may be changing, but right now I'm sharing with you what the current standards are. And in Massachusetts, Greenboro, Massachusetts has been working with Kestrel Land Trust for several years, and we've been trying to find property where we can establish a conservation burial ground. We tried for several years in the Connecticut River Valley, and we've not had too much success. And we've also had our heart broken several times. It's too wet, it's too rocky, the neighbors don't like it, it's too close to a public water supply. There's so much water on the property that once we add the 200-foot buffer zone by a stream, it doesn't leave us any room left for doing burials. So what we've just done is hire some professional engineers and analysts to help us identify land, and we've spread out from Worcester County all the way to Berkshire County now and looking for the land. So we all have our fingers crossed. Trees. So remember that opening slide about the inspiration? This living frame sprouts new living frames. Those tree roots are massive. So this is typical tree. And 50% of the roots are going beyond the drip line. So while many of us would like to think we could become a tree, we probably won't. In 1831, there was a special consecration of Mount Auburn Cemetery, and the Unitarian minister John Pierpoint wrote this tune. Decay, decay, 'tis stamped on all bloom and flower and flesh shall fade. Ye whispering trees, when we shall fall, be our long sleep beneath your shade. It's time to start planting trees so we can have shade to be buried under. I just think this is fabulous. And Mount Auburn is not just a cemetery, it's also a botanic garden. So it is possible to bury near and around trees. But let's see what else can happen. These things are not green burial, cremation by fire, something called alkaline hydrolysis, something else called natural organic reduction, also known as human composting. You may have heard of those things. Cremation by fire. It uses fossil fuels. It does take at least 90 minutes, depending on equipment, often 2 to 3 hours to cremate an adult. There is a release of emissions, including, yes, if you have mercury fillings, these things are vaporized and they go up through the smokestack. Remaining bones from cremation are pulverized, and then those things are ultimately crushed and given back to the family members. They have a really high salt content and a really high pH of almost 12. This image comes from a company called Let Your Love Grow, and they've created a compost, let's say, to mitigate the saltiness and the high pH. So I think at one point, this image probably would have 2 urns in it, but you can see the clump on the right-hand side of the image that was in a biodegradable container that totally dissolved. And so these are now the salty clump left by cremated remains. So the moral of this slide is the trees can't use that. In fact, the trees are going to go around it. They're not going to get any nutrients from this particular cremated remain. And this is very typical of what happens with cremated remains. Alkaline hydrolysis. This is also known as water cremation. It uses 80% less energy than flame cremation, but it uses 100 to 300 gallons of heated water that's under pressure. And after 2 to 3 hours, the soft tissues are liquefied and leaves behind bones, which are also pulverized. And there's 20% more of those bones, and therefore what that means is you now need larger urns to hold the bones from alkaline hydrolysis. This is not yet legal in Massachusetts. It's being discussed in the legislature, and Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 114, may be updated in the next year. That's also true for this thing, human composting, natural organic reduction. It's legal in 7 states and being done in Washington, Oregon, and Colorado. In this case, the body is covered with plant material, alfalfa, straw, and then it's tumbled for 8 to 12 weeks in a temperature and humidity controlled vessel. And then the bones are removed from that stuff, pulverized and put back in, and the end result is in fact something they call compost, but it's almost more like bark mulch, and you get a small truckload of it. Yes, a small truckload. So this is also being discussed to become legal in Massachusetts. The images show the one on the top is Washington from Recompose. Katrina Spade was the woman who helped design this process, and it started off as a project called the Urban Death Project. And the idea was city cemeteries are running out of space. We've got to find a better way to take care of the dead and do something with their remains if we can't put them into the earth somehow. So this is over several years. She's got this idea. When it became legal in Washington State, this man Walt Patrick, he also owns a cemetery. He created these cradles, some type of vessel. He does the same thing, but this is the low impact method. He puts somebody on right in his property of the cemetery, and they sit in this tub outside, and he rotates it when it needs to be, and so it's legal. And this happens to be an example of one of the output from one of his people. And people are signing up to have this done. People want to be composted in this way, so it is working and happening. But can you really use a truckload in your domain? So it's not clear yet, is this soil or is it human remains? There's still a discussion about what do we call this. Planning for your own green burial, and it might take you a year or more. And you could have a family-directed funeral, or you could speak with a funeral director and get a variety of prices, and also check your local cemetery. The bylaws or the rules and regulations may take a really long time, over a year, to get approved. Who's going to write them? Who's going to approve them? And then if they don't get approved, what's your plan B? It's very sad for me to actually receive a phone call for somebody who says, oh, my husband is in hospice, he has maybe another year to live, and he wants a green burial. I'll say, okay, I'll check our database. And I have to say, I'm sorry, you know, it's almost 50 miles is the closest to your location. So not everybody can have a green burial if they want one. And the costs in general are really hard to figure out. Location of the funeral home, the cemetery, the types of services involved, cemetery fees. There's 2 here, the topping off the grave after the grave subsides. So there are municipal cemeteries who do now allow green burial, but they may charge extra to be able to top off the grave. What does top off the grave mean? Well, after the body has been buried, 6 months, maybe 18 months later, the earth subsides a little bit. And so somebody goes back to add more soil and maybe more seed. This is particularly important for a lawn landscape cemetery. So the conventional full-service burial, $6,000 to $10,000, and the best way for us to calculate what a green burial might cost is to take out the embalming fee, the outer container, get a more moderately priced, and we're looking at $2,300 to $4,600. But once again, these are estimates, and you would really be best served by meeting with a couple of funeral directors and talking to your local cemetery to find out what you can have. I did check in Northampton. I was shocked to see that they allow a 4-grave lot for $1,000. If you can get that, get it. I'm not sure it's still available. This price list was, I think, 2009. So the database I mentioned is up on greenburialma.org cemetery database. And it's crowdsourced. We have volunteers who call cemeteries. And Northampton, I'm afraid, does not allow green burial. And I did call and speak to somebody there today because the bylaws didn't say a vault was required. That's usually my key indicator to indicate that green burial is or isn't allowed. I think the bylaws will be changing and the rules and regulations will be changing, and I think pretty soon it will say a vault or grave liner is required. But there are beautiful cemeteries here in Northampton. So if you can't have a green burial in this manner I've been speaking, see if you can skip the embalming, choose a coffin or a casket that's made of soft wood, and ask if they cannot use the grave liner, or possibly what's known as the Jewish or an Orthodox grave liner, where about 75 of the bottom is cut out from that concrete box, and the body can still come in contact with the earth. Some resources on the web. I have some materials on the back table for those of you who are here. You can also just look at greenburialma.org and find these other links. So I do believe green burial is the way to go. And I'm happy to take your questions now. And any questions we don't have time to answer, you can email them to info@greenburialma.org.
Thank you very much.
Are you able to come up to this mic?
People can come up to the mic. We have one question in chat. And the one question is, why aren't there any in Northampton?
I don't know.
Yes, you should have answered that one.
Don't you want to give some information?
Oh, I should. All right, the next speaker who's coming on April 5th is Joe Silverman, and he's going to discuss climate change. And just to let you know, it's always the first Friday of the month, always at 2 o'clock. We'll always have it at the senior center in Highbury unless the weather is awful, and who knows what awful is defined as these days, but it's always the first Friday. It's on the bulletin in the Northampton Neighbor website. The Comms periodical also mentions it, and the senior center mentions it, which is the Comms. Is that what I was doing? Okay, thank you, Naomi. All right.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Hold on 1 minute, if you would, Karen, because I see another chat question has just come. A Better Place Forest in Hampshire. Is there a green option burial there? You know?
So Better Place Forest is a beautiful location. It's up in Florida, Massachusetts. I think that's the one this person is referring to. It's for cremation only. And what you do is buy a legacy tree there, and it could range in price from something like $4,000 to $24,000. And then forever and ever, your family can help at their remains scattered around those trees. It's not green, and given what you just saw with that slide with the cremated remains, it's not a good thing either. But what they do is take the cremated remains, mix it up with soil, and then place it around the tree. So it's sort of scattering things around. It's also not right now the one in Florida, Massachusetts, I don't think yet has its conservation restriction or easement with a land trust. I know they were talking about that. I don't think it's happened yet. So it's for cremation only, and it does not allow for body burials.
Okay, and Eddie or Edie Kirk has raised their hand. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Candace, I heard you mentioned the 200 feet statement that can't be closer than 200 feet to water. Can you go?
Yeah. Th- Thank you. It refers to the Wetlands Protection Act and the river, it's about clean water. So there are certain buffers regardless of if it's a cemetery or some other type of development. There are buffers we have to abide by. And so finding land for a new cemetery, now this is not something that happens even every decade. So it requires input from the Department of Environmental Protection. It requires input from the local the local health department. They have the final say on it. And we really do have to look out for adjacent wells. Are there private wells nearby? Are there, what's the road frontage for something? And we have to dig holes. We have to dig at least a 10-foot pit and make sure that the water table isn't too high. So there's a lot involved in finding the right land, not to mention finding the right landowner who's willing to sell the land for a cemetery. That's also really key, because we have found a couple parcels that we think would be perfect, but we can't even get on the property to do any testing, and it's only because, I don't think we're ready. So prepare and plan. This is why we're having this discussion.
And there's a sort of follow-up question to Edie's, and that is, how do we put pressure on Northampton to have green areas?
Putting pressure on Northampton. Well, I know you can call the man who is running the cemeteries, and he will tell you he doesn't make the sole decisions. So, yeah, and I know Northampton would be more than happy to have a conservation burial ground. So perhaps if there's open space in the city, they would be happy to have it open up and be eligible to all of the Northampton residents, and in fact open to more people in the state, because one of the properties that we did look at was in Florence, and it turned out not to be suitable, but we got pretty far down the road, and we know we had a lot of positive feedback from the planning department.
And one more, Julie has said she set up a green burial at Wildwood. It wasn't difficult. It wasn't a difficult process, nor did it take a lot of time. I also got to use one of my own garden stones as a marker for the monument.
Yes, Wildwood Cemetery in Amherst, Massachusetts is a stunning, lovely cemetery. It's quite beautiful, and they have green burial through a wooded section of the cemetery there. They may even have them in some of the other areas. I do know Wildwood pretty well. It's a private, nonprofit cemetery.
That sounds good. Okay, Karen, you're on.
Sure, it's really just a short question. You mentioned there was a hybrid, and then the conventional, and then the land trust, but natural, that's what I'm asking about. So is natural a burial, does that mean it's on your own land?
I was wondering if somebody would ask about home burial. Home burial is allowed in Massachusetts. So if you're somebody who has several acres of land, and if your town or city will allow a home burial, you need to get permission from them. You need to go to the health department. You need to also have a little fenced off area where your little burial ground is. And when you go to sell your property, your real estate agent probably won't be happy about it. They're gonna say, oh my God, I have to sell a property that has a burial ground on it. But it's possible. And in most cases, people who want a home burial, they're doing it because they want a green burial, and they do it because they love their land. So I have a plug here. For those of you who want the home burial, if you also have 50 acres of land, consider taking, that's, even 25 acres of those land, selling it or giving it to a land trust. Some of that can go to a cemetery, and maybe we could put a 5-acre cemetery on a 25-acre parcel and conserve it forever and ever. So that's what I'd like to say to those home burial people.
Sounds like a goal.
Is there any issue with crossing state lines? Like if you live and die in Massachusetts, but you found a green burial place in New York, then what happens?
I'm not so good about cross-state stuff. Yes, you can do it. I do know one of my colleagues, her husband died. He died here in Massachusetts. He was buried up in Maine. And even though that was a distance, he grew up in Maine, so it wasn't that far for him. And she was able to transport the body herself with the help of her sons and other family members. So it is doable. If you're working with a funeral director, there's probably some more paperwork involved, but it's doable.
Just wonder about animals. Do they dig up these graves?
Oh, thank you. I forgot to mention that on one of those slides. Typically, we have at least 2 feet between ground and the top of your casket or your grave. So that means an animal would have to dig down 2 feet, but honestly, we're not that delicious to them, and we don't have enough on us for them to want to go down that deep. So they would expend more energy to get down to us, and they wouldn't find enough to eat. So I'm told 18 inches to 2 feet is a good enough smell barrier so those critters aren't going to dig down. I do know from speaking to another cemeterian that he called me after I gave a presentation about green burial. He called me and said, I had a problem. And we think the problem was his burial was less than 2 feet, so it was closer to the surface. So possibly a coyote smelled something and tried to dig it. So he filled it in, and then it happened again. So then he filled it in with some mothballs, and then he filled it in again, and that stopped the coyote.
There's another question that just came up in chat saying, Candace, thank you so much for this invaluable information. Do you know if the state vets cemeteries, Agawam, Winchendon, or the National Federal VA Cemetery in Bourne on the Cape allow green burial?
I do not know if the Veterans Cemetery here in Massachusetts allow green burial. I do know that veterans across the country want green burial, and that there was talk about one, I think it was in Arizona or Colorado, where they were going to have a green burial section for veterans. But I'm afraid I don't know the answers to Massachusetts. But we can get that information and we'll add it to our database.
Another question is Anne is coming up. Are you asking a question? Okay. I understand that there just recently is a green burial place in Greenfield. Do you know anything about it? I don't know the name.
I don't believe it's Greenfield. There's a beautiful little forested section of a cemetery in Montague. And there's also Gill, Massachusetts, Riverside Natural Cemetery. So they're both town cemeteries, but they allow non-residents. And so often there might be a fee for non-residents because it's your tax dollars at work that often help pay for your municipal cemetery plot. So that's why there's often an additional fee for non-residents. So Montague and Greenfield, and definitely go check greenburialma.org cemetery-database, and there's a sort of like an Excel spreadsheet of all the places that allow green burial, and we always add to that.
Thank you again for a great presentation. And I'm curious about the obstacles to green burials. I'm wondering, certainly I would imagine the funeral, the traditions by which we have done funerals and buried people. But I'm also wondering, are there any religious objections that you have happened to have run into and how they're dealt with?
It's usually just the opposite. The Jewish tradition is green burial, the Islamic tradition is green burial. There was a situation in the Berkshires where I was shocked to find that the Catholic diocese for one particular burial ground wasn't allowing somebody's green burial there. We never did get it approved. I don't understand why exactly at all, but I can tell you that the Pope even likes green burial. So it's usually just the opposite. Everybody wants a green burial. That's really what it's, and so why don't we get to have them? There seems to be an ick factor. Like we stopped taking care of our dead, and then we decide that, oh, the death is scary, it's got to have disease with it. So we have this misinformation that it's disease-ridden and it's going to cause us some illness. But that's not, in fact, what happens. So it really is the greenest way to go is just put yourself in your, I don't know, your pajamas or just in your shroud and let yourself be taken care of by the earth. It really is one of those things where the stuff of our body is in fact nutrients that the earth can use. So we end up on the plus side. When you compare it with flame cremation or alkaline hydrolysis or the natural organic reduction, this is the plus side, the body of our cells. Just like, a deer, a squirrel, a rabbit, a turtle, what do we do with those things when they die? Well, they just go off and die in the woods someplace, right? That's what we are. Let's just let ourselves die in the earth.
So,
We have one more question?
yeah, quickly, so given that, how big a yard do you have? Seriously?
Yeah, so if you're gonna have a home burial, what kind of requirements are there?
Yeah.
It depends. If you have a private well, I don't know exactly, I think it might be at least 150 feet from your private well, which is where you would have your burials, but I would have to check that with the local health department. But what's interesting about that is your septic system also has to be 150 feet from your well. So think about that. You're putting all kinds of stuff into your septic system every single day versus a body that might go into the earth, every 25 years if you're lucky, every 50 years. So there's a disconnect between how we dispose of our bodies and how we dispose of things going into the toilet. So I can tell you also that neighbors might be against your home burial ground. And I understand what we now need to do in finding a cemetery. We need at least 750 feet from a neighboring well and from our own well. So that might be used also as a valid standard for creating a home burial ground.
There's a question in chat. Thoughts on things like mushroom soups or tree pods? Oh, I have to say that louder. Mushroom soups or tree pods?
Yes, so the mushroom suit, it's basically a shroud that's been infused with mycorrhizae, a mushroom that helps decompose the body. And it was considered that, it was actually at first started off as an art project, and oh my goodness, it got other legs as a shroud that might be able to neutralize toxins in the body. After scientific study, it was determined that that is not true. Those mushrooms infused into the shroud did not neutralize the toxins in the body. Therefore, they stopped making it. So the mushroom suit is no longer available to you if you think you still want one. And the tree pod, I used to think that the images I saw was of somebody crouched up in a giant egg-shaped thing, and there was a tree growing on top of that person. Well, think about the practicality of that. It's hard enough to get a casket over to some location. Imagine trying to get somebody crunched up in a a fetal position into one of those pods to get them then to put them in the ground. So that's not really going to happen. And so now they sell little urns, and the little urns have been somehow infused, or maybe you add more compost around them, and they claim you can have a tree on top of it. Well, yeah, you can do it, but you don't need to buy something special to do it. You can just pour your remains in the ground. And the tree roots are smart, right? Trees are smart, plants are smart. They're not going to go into the cremated remains because they're too salty. They're a pH of 12, and they're like, ugh, I can't use this. So most things like that you see that claim to be the greenest of green are pretty gimmicky.
There's another question from chat, and that is, what about the land that you'd be taking up that might be used better for housing or other important community needs?
Yeah, excellent question. What about the land? That's one of the things when I worked at Mount Auburn Cemetery, we really did put people in cheek by jowl. And Mount Auburn has 175 acres on the edge of Cambridge, Massachusetts. I mean, it's a very urban surrounding, and yet there are 100,000 people buried there. And so one of the things about the Green Burial Council standards, where they identify the density of 500 to 600 people in a natural burial ground, but if it's a conserved burial ground, we only allow 300 to 400 burials per acre. A friend of mine refers to that as burial sprawl. So we still have to need more acres to bury more people, to bury more people, to bury more people. And I once said to somebody, so what are you going to do when you run out of acres? And they said, buy more land. So, wow, good luck. So I am so thrilled a couple of weeks ago when I heard my colleague Lee Webster give a talk, and she said they're now discussing, is that density really makes sense? Because if I buried somebody 50 years ago, why can't I put another burial in that same grave, or even one right next to it? So I think the density requirements will be changing, and that will be changing as a result of the study at those conservation burial grounds, at those natural burial grounds. So I think there's going to be a change because, yeah, I agree. You don't want to take up valuable space that could be used for housing or certainly farmland. We certainly right now are not looking for farmland to build a cemetery on. But I think there's got to be a balance of finding the right land for a cemetery that could be adjacent to some other type of development. And the cemetery itself could be used for open space, because we know nature is good for us.
Name, go ahead.
Well, this is my second question, but, when I talk to our friends about burial, many people I know say, oh gosh, I just don't know how to figure out. So to think about it as something that you do good for the earth is a really powerful argument. But I think you didn't quite answer Anne's question, which was, what is the resistance to this? Or is there a funeral industry that loses profit as a result of big areas?
Yes, the funeral industry could be losing some of their profit. It could be the sale of a beautiful mahogany casket that they want to sell you. So this thing happening in the Massachusetts legislation right now with alkaline hydrolysis and natural organic reduction, those are potentially two more forms of disposition, right, for the body. Right now, the way the legislation reads is that will be only allowed in cemeteries, just like crematories right now are only allowed in cemeteries in Massachusetts. So the first time, if this gets passed, it will be passed for cemeteries only, those 3 options. The funeral industry is like, oh, wait a minute, we lost out on cremation when that became legal, and we don't get to do that. They are now gonna come back, and I'm sure amend the legislation that says funeral homes should be able to do alkaline hydrolysis and natural organic reduction. So we want to be able to do that. So I think there's going to be a change, and that will be the way that the funeral industry can come back and potentially recoup costs if there's green burial, and if there's so many people who are still doing, involving their own family and midwives or death doulas or funeral celebrants. Those are the kinds of people perhaps taking away some work that the funeral industry is doing, but there's still plenty of people also using the funeral industry, shall I say. Did that answer your question? Almost, it looks like.
All right, on Zoom, we've decided that we can't open up in black, but we can certainly say thank you. You did a great job, we really appreciated this. And we ran over a little bit, but we're essentially on time. Any last questions? Go for it, otherwise, let's clap. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.